let's just finish up, just sort of reiterate the traditional Hawaiian landscape. So as I mentioned last time, sort of in finishing, you have to remember the whole concept of land and people and place is totally different than the Euro-American, staggeringly different than the Euro-American that end up in North America, i.e. the United States, where you're migrants, you're highly mobile, and you're sort of driven in large part by the way that things look. So visual access, shared perceptions of value and success in the landscape, all these things become very much normative, but they also become very portable. You could build a house in Connecticut, you could build the same house in Ohio somewhere, and as long as you've got the same people around you, it's the same. There's not really any distinction made just by virtue of location. In the Hawaiian context, and again, the key to remember with a lot of this is that people are going to be moving around a lot, obviously, is since place and who you are and what you are is all linked together intimately, you're not going to get people wandering around. You're not going to get the idea of, well, I want to see what's on the other side of the hill. You're not going to get the idea of, well, come to this new place and be successful. That whole Virginia city logic would be entirely foreign to Hawaiians of this earlier period. Now, having said that, then the other key emphasis, again, just to reiterate, is that then in that concept, seniors and markers of place become really important because the seniors, because this is a non-literate society, and since you don't have the written records, so what people know about their world is carried in people's heads. And this is true in most societies, right down to relatively recently. So old folks are repositories of knowledge, or the equivalent of a Google search or Wikipedia or something like that. And so age was an important factor in relationships and power. Power in large part was defined by age. Now, also, of course, the seniors in some ways, especially if it's genealogically senior, are also then all closer to the ancestors, just by virtue of the fact that they represent a prior generation, a prior time. And since the ancestors are still around, you end up with sort of a weird situation where you've got the oldest living people and they've got the ancestor being, but the groups in between, the old folks that have passed away, sort of go back into this corpus of stuff that makes up the ancestor. And so the new members of the family are always sort of made out of the stuff that's the family. And you still see a little bit of this, in discussions here in Hawaii, but also in Asia when people talk about, oh, well, so-and-so's a lot like their great grandma, with sort of the implication that somehow part of their great grandma's in the kid. That's actually sort of a small version of this whole idea that everyone in the family is actually made from sort of a common body of material, and the ancestor is the centerpiece of that material and also the controller of the material. So place, ancestors, and the family are a package deal. Now, keeping that in mind, let's take a quick look at what happens in the late, we'll just say 1550s. Here's just the list of the changes that occur. I'll get into in just a second why the changes occur, but here's just what they are. So basically, the whole system you guys were just listening to the last couple of presentations or podcasts, they're gone. This new system is radically different. And this new system now, rather than people being defined by clan and in large part by place, now they're turned into basically 2.5 social systems in the sense of a classic caste system. At the top, you have the Ari'i or Ariki, and these include folks that are called Tonga or Kahuna, who are your knowledge-based folks, oftentimes ritual. And they're also the folks that manage the property called Tonahiki or Konahiki. These are all packaged in the Ariki or Ari'i. These are the elites. This group has very little interaction with everyone else. They're considered better. They're actually considered to be physically different in the sense that they're not even, I suppose maybe you want to call them the same species as the folks below them. So it really is a classic caste system where the groups are entirely segregated. The largest body, the vast majority of the population are called Makai and Ananao. The old term that was frequently used in the earlier period was Manahune, which oftentimes here you still hear saying Menehune, the little people. But that really wasn't the way it was concepted. In this later period, then they probably did use the term Menehune in some ways because the commoners were seen as little people. And so what happens in this period in the 1550s is you go from a a collectively based, family-based, place-based system to a system in which you have elites and then you have the vast majority of the population. Neither the elites nor the population actually control the land. The land sort of becomes amorphously controlled by the high chief, Ariki-Aimoku. There's analogies made to the fact that you have gods, you now have 4 gods or 5 gods, depending on how you want to look at it. But the interesting thing here is the ancestors disappear. So the ancestors are no longer the legitimizers of place. Legitimizers of place now are sort of abstractly, Tu, Tono, or whatever, but in reality, they're the high chief. So the Ariki-Aimoku, for example, Kahikili on the big on Maui, is the high chief. And so he's the one that now basically owns the land. And he's the one that decides what happens to the land. He's the one that literally physically moves people on the landscape, or moves people, orders them to go to a place, evicts them from a place. That's all done now by this group of elites. The Makainana now really have no relationship to land in the sense that they might have relationship emotionally to land. They might have it personally with their own ancestors, but they can't use this claim with the chiefs. You can't go to a chief and say, my family got this property from Kamapuaa, so therefore it should stay ours. The chief would look at you like, you're growing horns on your head. It isn't, he's in charge of the property. It's not your purview to tell him. So now the Makainana become almost entirely segregated from the chiefs. I mean, you see this a lot because now you start to get the invocation of the concept of kapu or tapu. And tapu is basically the idea that chiefs can control access and behavior of everyone else. In fact, highest chiefs can control access behavior even of lower chiefs. And so now you end up with a very regulated society where there's all sorts of strictures and constructions and structures about movement and control and who can do what. And there's spectacularly brutal punishments if you break these. And a classic example is the papa in the hell that we have here in Vaititi, which was a luakini or human sacrifice how whose major function was sort of reinforcement, if you would, of tapu. So what you end up with these formal ritual sites, among other things in the traditional system, what you would find in a house site would be a niche in a corner or maybe a small ahu of stacked stones with an upright stone in it, oftentimes still called ahu today. That's pretty much probably all that families had, because if the family had a direct link to their ancestor, they don't really need a place in which they have to interact with the ancestor because the ancestor's around them. So, you didn't need a place to, if you're in the Kahana, you didn't need a place to pray or communicate with Kamapuaa because he's there. You might find a place where it's quiet or a place that you think he likes, but you don't need some sort of centralized ritual location to do this. You don't need the equivalent of a church or in the Hawaiian concept of Paao. In this later period, we now have chiefs in control of everything. Among other things that chiefs control are mana. Chiefs control mana through rituals that they perform, and then they can allocate or give out that mana to the people underneath them. So in a real simplistic way, ariki are responsible for the mana of Makainana. They do this through rituals that are performed at Heao. And so all these rituals that are performed become very formalized, very complex, very ritualistic, and in some cases involve human sacrifice when they're really serious ones. Those were done for the purpose of reinforcing the fact that the ariki were actually different types of things than Makainana. And so all of a sudden the landscape changes radically because no longer do you have the concept of ahupua'a, families and clans being sort of a almost discrete package. Now you have chiefs that can literally move through different ahupua'a. They can, as the high chiefs did, especially in the Big Island, they can actually invade and take over parts of Maui. So they can acquire parts of islands that weren't even theirs traditionally and just take them over. They're totally disinterested in the concept of ahupua'a. Now it's control of property, control of land, control of resources, and control of people. And they have that. And so, for example, my area of research in Kanaio and East Maui, the vast majority of folks that live there now were actually imported by Kalani Opu'u, the high chief of the Big Island, who took over that part of Maui. He either genocided or he removed the folks from that part of Maui and Kanaio, as far as we know. We don't even know the names of the families that live there. And he actually imported a whole chunk of families that he ordered to move from North Kohala over to East Maui, Kanaio side. And so the families now, the Ueokalanis and the Poipunis and those folks, They still, when they have their family reunions, they have part of it on Maui, but they also have the family reunion in Kohala because that's where the rest of the family still is. So even though they're Hawaiian families and they've been on Maui now, for a couple of 100 years, they're very aware and it's very clearly said that, they did not come over here by choice. They came over here because the high chief ordered them to move from one place to the other. If you think about it, in the traditional concept, that wouldn't make any sense because ancestors were in charge of property. A chief's, if they existed, didn't have that type of control. That wasn't their prerogative to make those types of choices. So what you also get then is in this new world, this world of the 1600s, is you now get a whole mess of places that are kapu in terms of who can access them. So you get places that are only usable by chiefs. So the Ariki, for example, control heiau. Commoners aren't allowed anywhere near a heiau unless it's turned off so that people can repair it. But when it's functional, you can't go anywhere near it. So again, Papa'enaena, which is now La Pietra school and on the slopes of Leahi of Diamond Head. That was a place that had enormous ritual significance. So, Maka'aina no were not allowed anywhere near that. In fact, they probably had to go all the way past what would now be Kapahulu and go around there. For some reason, they had to go down to the shore. And I can guarantee you they weren't allowed to go down to the shore on what would now be Diamond Head Road. Going through there would undoubtedly get you whacked because you would have broken kapu. And then what would happen in that, especially with that heiau, and we actually have historical examples of it, is you would have your arms and your legs broken. You'd be stuck in a storage pit in the heiau in Papa'enaena. And then when they had some sort of ritual they had to perform, you would be brought up and then sacrificed to the god Tu, because it's one of Tu's heiaus. So what you had then is all of a sudden now you have a landscape which is highly ritualized, highly structured, highly formalized, and very much, defined by elites to the exclusion in many cases of other folks in many places. So it's a radically different world than it was before. And this is the world that shows up in the 1500s with the migration of a religious movement. I think I mentioned this last time in the last podcast. A religious movement starts up in the Marquesas. And it's a new religion. It has nothing to do with the Europeans. This is way before the Europeans ever showed up. But it's an in-place religion. In other words, a Marquesan guy gets a vision. He is talked to by a spirit being whatever, and this new spirit basically says that the people are living in lies, they're living in a world of sin, whatever you want to phrase it. And so his job, his mandate is to bring them the new religion and get rid of the old ways, because the old ways are bad. And this is this new religion. And this new religion moves like wildfire through eastern central Polynesia very, very quickly. It's usually called the Oro cult because it has this new god, this new akua called Oro. And it becomes dominant in the Marquesas, in the society groups like Tahiti, moves into Samoa and Tonga for a short period of time, gets chucked out. And in this process of this new religion, they're very big on missionaries. It was very big on members of the elite because it was very much an elite religion. Some members of the Reiki were expected, for example, to literally go in canoes and go to places and bring this new word, the new God, to the old places. And some of these guys come up here. This is Paao. Now, we're not sure that the Paao stories, it really isn't too clear whether Paao is a technical term for the name of a priest in terms of his personal name. If it's the name of, whatever rank he was in the religious system. We know that the Oro cult was ranked. But anyways, what you have is a group of missionaries coming up here from central Polynesia, or eastern Polynesia, coming up here to Hawaii. They set up shop at Wauula Heiau, which has just recently been swallowed up by Kilauea, in basically Puna. And so they set up shop there, and they start their new religion. They start proselytizing or missionizing the new religion. On the Big Island, it really quickly becomes really popular, just like it did in eastern Polynesia. So in the eastern part of the islands, especially the Big Island, all the elites jump on board with us, and very quickly the Big Island bangs turns into the system we've got listed up here in the shopping list. Maui pretty quickly follows suit, in part probably even if people weren't necessarily buying into the religious message. If you're designated as one of the elites, then why wouldn't you want to have a religion which says you're special? Also for very ambitious people, If you notice, if you're ambitious, a system of EID-GE is really more popular than being head of a clan, because if you're head of a clan, your ambitions are pretty much stopped where they're at because you can't expand other clans' properties because that's other ancestors' properties, and you don't want to pick a fight with a god. In this system, in this new system, you're just fighting other people. The gods don't own places. The gods don't manage or monitor what's going on in places. That's now the prerogative of chiefs. And so one EID-GE can go and pick a fight with another EID-GE, and if you win, then you take over their property. And this, of course, is Kamehameha, the son of Kalaniʻo, who basically comes to power over his half brother's body, takes over the part of the Big Island, and eventually consolidates the Big Island, taking over areas that were not, he had no prerogative to, but he had the military power to take it over. Then takes over Maui and takes over the rest of the islands, with the exception of Hawaii. And you end up with the Hawaiian monarchy. So this system that comes into place in the 1600s is hugely important because for two reasons. One is it radically changes the concept of place. If you look at Hawaiian communities now, you generally find that there's two types of Hawaiian communities. There's the Hawaiian community of the EID-GE. So this is the system that, to a certain extent, you see in, for example, the Mahele. This is the system of chiefs, high chiefs. Land was given to them because they were the son of so-and-so or such and such, but they're always referring to another chief. So you're given property because another chief gave it to you or a high chief gave it to you. So there's always people involved. You're not going to, this is not a system where you're going to invoke Pele, for example. Oh, I got the property from Pele. Everyone's going to be looking at you like, what? The second part of this is that in the system, then, people don't have any control over property. So you might, commoners, for example, very frequently did, in fact, still do, for example, in my part of East Maui, the Makainana families there, the families that actually are of the place there, still talk about the traditions in that place, where Pele was running around in the cave and so was doing this, and one of the shark gods was doing that. And that ties those places in, and that's why those places have names to them. But what you don't see quite as clearly is the relationship of the people with the named places and the ancestors that were there. So what happens in this new religion is one of its main goals was apparently to sort of breach the idea of clan or break it, so that you no longer had people tied to land, and that was the form of legitimacy. Now legitimacy is in the power of the chiefs. And so it's an entirely different social political system. And among other things, what then happens is the size of the social network you have and the social status, your genealogy, now becomes hugely important, not because it ties you to place, but because it ties you to social rank. So it's very much like European royalty, in that, if you say you're part of the British royal family, that gives you a certain elite status because of your genealogical links with the whatever their last name is. So it's not based in place. It's not based on the fact, well, I was born in Devonshire, or I was born in Leeds, or something like that. Now it's entirely based on your genealogical relationship with powerful people or important people. That's what happens here. So this is the enormous change that occurs between the 1600s and right into the time when Cook bumps into them in the 1778. Now, one of the key aspects of this, sort of as an aside, is that this particular system looks a lot like European, monarchical systems that were in place in the 1700s. This has a huge impact, just not relevant to us per se directly, but it has a huge impact when the Europeans, specifically Cook and these other guys, La Perouse, so the French, the British, the Russians, when everyone comes and sees the Hawaiians, what they see is Hawaiian royalty. They see a Hawaiian royal system. Then in many ways they're dressed different, sure, and they got different stuff, but they've got ritual sites, which you could call a church. They've got, people in charge, which you call royalty or elites. And so since you don't see this in most of the rest of Polynesia, this is one reason why the Europeans treat Hawaiians very differently than they treat even other Polynesians, because they see Hawaii as basically having a system of governance and a system of social structure that's very similar to what they're used to. And so this means the Hawaiians, and ironically to the Europeans, it means the Hawaiians are civilized. There's one reason why the Hawaiian monarchy is able to survive, at least for the first 40 or 50 years, is because the Europeans don't think it's the same as theirs, but they think it's sort of like a variant form. So therefore, they're going to, give it more respect, I guess, the very right word, than they would a system of of clan bases like you're going to find in, say, Tonga or Samoa. Now, one of the side effects of this, and again, is that you end up then with two religious systems. So if you want to think about this, it'd be similar to what you find in, say, Scotland or Wales or even Ireland, where you've got Christianity has been down there for a really long time. But then underneath them, you still got clan systems in Highland Scotland and a lot of Wales and a lot of Ireland. You still got the concepts of clans. People are still clans, and they still have stories tied to particular places and to ancestors, which are still around. So on one hand, Christianity is the new religion, even though it's now been 2,000, 1,500 years there. On the other hand, the old system didn't disappear. It just sort of went into hiding, but it still pops up. It didn't vanish. In the same way here in Hawaii, what happens is the old religion, the old clan-based, place-based religion doesn't completely vanish. Your elites don't have anything to do with it because they're now, of course, they're the new big popularizers of the new religion because they have the great advantage of it. But what you find is for the Makainana, a lot of the Makainana are still tied to parts of the older system. They're still tied to a certain extent to place. They're still tied to a certain extent to ancestors. They still have stories of ancestors. Of course, now the problem is, for example, because the folks I know in East Maui, is all those folks that were then forcibly moved by the high chief from Kohala to Maui. Then they're in a part of the Hawaiian environment that they don't have stories attached to. They maybe learn stories from the folks that were there, but there's still a big sense of place if they're Makainana would still be back in Kohala and the Big Island because that's where they're from, if you want to think of it that way. And there's a huge movement of people back and forth, and in most cases not by choice, that occurs as the high chiefs, take over property, dominate property, and change things. Kalaniʻo Pua is probably the most famous. He gets pissed off when he loses a battle on Maui, goes to Lanai, for example, completely wipes out the entire population, wipes out a large chunk of the population on Molokai before he goes back home to the Big Island. So these guys are not screwing around. This is a very, very different world they live in and function in than the world that existed prior to this. So in the old system, the landforms and the shape of land and everything were tied to indicators of mana, very similar to Chinese feng shui. And where you put things was a critical factor tied to manipulating the mana in the landscape and the mana in places. And that's your Waialeale text. In this later period from the 1600s, which you end up now, and I suspect the Waialeale was one of these, is you end up with a group of Tonga or Kahuna, who are actually specialists in landform analysis. So they look at a landform and they decide what should be there. Now, these guys, you have to remember that Tongas or Kahunas were actually of the Ari'i. So you didn't have Makainana Tongas. Tongas were of the elites. They were just one of the groups. And so they were of Ari'i families. They were of Ari'i birth. They were of Ari'i, caste. One of their main functions, or at least one of the group's main functions, was to decide where to put things, where to put residences, especially of chiefs, how to control the use of the functionality of the landscape, where stream diversion should take place. Very importantly, one of their major functions is where do you put a ritual site? Where do you put a hea, or where do you put a koa? Where do you put indicators for rituals for mana control? Which are, of course, the prerogative of them and their relatives. So this became a big part of the Hawaiian system, probably already was in many ways, but now in this later period becomes a huge part because where you place things now is not only a manifestation of tapping mana, but it's also a manifestation of the power of people, the chiefs. So very, very different logic. Having said that, it's still different than the European because these places are not portable. It's not like the chapel at Chaminade. The chapel at Chaminade was just put there, I think, because that has a good view. I'm not sure. No one ever seemed to tell me. But there's no ritual reason for it being there. There's no ritual for the church on Waialae, St. Patrick's, or whatever it is. That just ended up there. So in the Hawaiian system, the Tonga would only put places like Hale in places that, for whatever set of criteria they decided had access to, or was already using, or somehow had access to mana, or could be used to tap mana. So it was a very sophisticated, very complex, very structural analysis they did. And again, the only piece we have left, at least it's accessible, is the Waialeale text that you've got. So this is the Hawaiian landscape. So key thing to remember is there were actually already two Hawaiian landscapes at the time the Europeans arrived. There's the Hawaiian landscape of the elites, who are the ones the Europeans are hanging out with the most. But then there's also the landscape of the commoners, the Makana, who in many ways could probably be called technically peasants because they don't have ownership of property anymore. This becomes a really complicated issue because when we look in the historic period in the Mahele, it's the lack of land ownership that really becomes a critical part of this discussion of the monarchy.